Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Tavern Adjacent. Thank you so much for joining me. We're back on the solo set. It's been a couple weeks. Last week we did our monthly Q&A, and the week before that we had a guest, Fall Cosplay, aka the wonderful Nixie from One For All. She was incredible, amazing to have on the show. Totally recommend you check out the episode if you haven't already. But yeah, we're back here on the solo set. Love having just a one on a few thousand discussion with you guys. And today we've got some interesting topics. Number one, I'm sure you saw the title, but we're going to be talking about Session Zero. There's a war going on in the shadows, a war being fought on the dumbest of platforms, obviously, Twitter, which, not unsurprising, but we're gonna talk about the war against Session Zero and why, just like it's always been, it's still pretty stupid. And then after that, we're gonna be doing a follow-up. I want to start doing these every once in a while when we have a tabletop tavern tips video on a topic that I don't get to cover everything on. We're gonna have a follow-up on the tabletop tavern tips video on the Adventure Zone graduation and actual play D&D podcast in general. What I like in actual play D&D podcast, how we can learn from them to play our own games, etc., etc. And then after that, we are going to end off with Campaign Diary, because I've got two really cool sessions to tell you guys about, and Thing of the Week. So yeah, without further ado, guys, let's get started. Alright, so Session Zero. What happened, guys? So, recently on Twitter, there was a lot of hubbub over a D&D thing. A D&D thing that's been pretty prominent recently because of Baldur's Gate 3, but illithid transformations. Basically, there's a blurb in the book that's like, hey, before you transform someone into an illithid during Session 0 or whenever, you should probably check up if that kind of content is okay at the games because you don't want to take away player agency. And some people got really, really upset about that. So, this isn't unsurprising, by the way. A lot of people get really upset over stuff like this for whatever reason. And I just want to say this at the top here. And I know I say this a lot, and I know it's starting to annoy some people, but keep in mind, not everyone watches all of my content, so it bears reiterating. But I run a game where there is a lot of death. A game that's pretty hard, all things considered. There's not necessarily illithid transformations specifically, because you don't really get transformed into an illithid. Your body gets disintegrated and used by them to grow their own bodies. You don't become one, you die. But other than that, look, the actual point that I'm trying to get at is that in my games, there is a lot of brutality. Here's the key, though. My players all know that. I tell my players very upfront, like, hey, you're entering into a game where combat is meant to be really challenging, and therefore you should probably, maybe not necessarily min-max your characters, but you should build your characters smart. You should pick a good stat spread, you should, pick somewhat optimal spells. I'm not saying you can't do anything RP related, not at all, but I am saying that you should consider combat heavily because combat is meant to be challenging here. I tell them that at the top, okay? Because, as we say all the time in RPG horror stories, communication is key. And I'm sorry that I wanted to rip my eyes out of my face when I'm watching all these people complain and whine that apparently communication is going to take all the consequences away from Dungeons & Dragons. Look, if you want your game to have consequences, that's awesome. I love consequences in D&D games. But here's the thing, man. Before the game even starts, at the top of everything, I tell players very straightforward, look, there's going to be consequences for your actions. Sometimes even, hey, during the game, I'm not going to tell my players what the consequences are going to be, but sometimes I will straight up tell them, hey, look, this decision that you're going to make right here, this decision matters. Big time. We're going to get into it deeper when we talk about Campaign Diary, when we talk about my D&D campaign. But yeah, sometimes I'll tell them that so that there's more weight. They consider stuff more. They know that whatever's happening isn't just flavor. I hope to get to the point where every decision they make, they're aware like, oh, this could have long-term effects. But sometimes I just need to do just do a little meta thing and tell them very straightforward, like, look, there's going to be big consequences to what you do in this moment. I get that might not be everyone's vibe, but I do think that no matter what, you should communicate with your players what kind of game you're going to be playing. A lot of people think, for some ungodly reason, that the concept of communication and all that stuff during Session 0, that's going to take away the consequences, or that's implying that games with consequences are bad. And like, come on, dude. That's dumb. The existence of games, the implication that there are games out there where the consequences aren't going to be as severe, doesn't mean that your games need to be just like that, right? Again, my games have a lot of major consequences. People die, sometimes like a lot of times. But again, I told my players that at the top, and they build their characters around it. Again, I want to like talk about all of the super cool stuff they did in the 2 D&D sessions that we're going to cover in Campaign Diary, but I'm trying to save it for there. But here, I'll say this. They built their characters pretty optimal with lots of different stuff they can do, and the way they planned out their characters is so cool. Like, my players were legitimately actually planning together. They worked around the difficulty of my combats, and it's made the game so much more awesome. Like, watching them strategize together, both during the sessions and like during just out of session stuff. Some of them have the same job, they work shifts together, and like they'll talk about D&D, and they'll talk about like how they're going to handle certain things and strategies they can come up together. Like, that is awesome, but that wouldn't happen if my players were unaware of the kind of game that I was running, right? So yeah, that's why communication is so important. So your players can actually respond to what's going on. Now, there's this other thing I saw. Like, oh, well, what if this ruins the surprise? Dude, if you need to surprise your players in order to keep your story good in this sense, like, look, I'm not saying you need to spoil every twist in your campaign, but if the concept of difficulty in combat or the idea of an illithid transformation, if that being in the campaign is such a big spoiler that completely ruins your story, I'm sorry to say this, man, but your story is probably bad. If such a basic part of the premise will ruin the entire narrative, your story sucks. Come on, man, really? Like, telling your players off the rip that combat will be hard or that transformations can occur, that's not going to ruin the story. At least it's not going to ruin any good story, right? Come on. It's also important to keep in mind that the reason this is so important is because so many people play Dungeons & Dragons and TTRPGs in general so differently. And I know people in the space say this all the time, but I feel like a lot of people in the space don't actually mean it. Because I swear to God, the amount of discussions I see over like, oh, I play like this, you play like that? That sounds stupid. I see that so often, so many times from people I really shouldn't be seeing it from. Come on. Like, here, again, this is a lot based on difficulty of the game itself. Like, you know, the initial premise, the initial triggering point was, oh, illicit transformations and that being possible in the game. Should that be possible? I don't know. But again, the key that the book was trying to hint at is that you need to tell people if it is possible, so they know that that extra aspect is introduced in the campaign. A lot of people don't play campaigns like that. You know, I play a campaign like that, but again, a lot of other people don't, and that's okay. Everyone plays the game differently. Joe Cat had a very sarcastic, very one-note response to this whole thing that basically summed up exactly what I just said. People play differently, and that's good. That's great. We should be accepting of those styles, but a big key of accepting that people play differently is telling people how, oh my God, is telling people how you play. Because again, assuming we all agree on the premise, the objective fact that people play these games differently, then we should also agree on the objective fact that we should tell people how we play so that when they join our games, they're not caught off guard and like put in a situation they don't want to be in. I was recently at a session 0 of a campaign that, honestly, after doing the session 0, I don't think I'm going to join. You know, I don't think I'm going to join. I'm not going to go in depth on it. I don't want to, you know, drag anyone. But I was recently at session 0, and I wasn't feeling it all the way. Like, I went through the session 0, I made the character, talked to one other player in the DM, blah, 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 blah. I talked to some of my friends, and, you know, I just decided this really isn't for me. It also doesn't help that, like, I got a pretty tight schedule when it comes to my life, so it might be hard for me to do a D&D campaign. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to understand that. I wouldn't know that if I didn't go to the session 0, if I didn't realize at that point that this kind of thing is not for me. And by the way, it doesn't mean that you always need to live in a bubble. Sometimes it's fun to jump out of your comfort zone and do something different from what you already know. Like maybe me jumping into a campaign with super fast and loose, way more casual combat, that might be enjoyable for me. Who knows? I haven't really done that in years, but I mean, it might be fun for me to try it out now. But, honestly, at the same time, this is a game. You should be trying to maximize your enjoyment of the game. And frankly, I think sticking to what you know, what you like, that's fine. Like for me, when I'm playing video games, I play the franchises I like. I'm not going out of my way to take hours and hours and hours out of my life and $70 on my bank account to play something I don't know I'm going to like, right? Same thing goes for D&D. Maybe it doesn't cost money, but it does cost time. And time is really important to me. So if it's not something that I'm immediately going to vibe with, I'm probably not going to play. Maybe trying it out, I'll learn something new. But Session 0 shows me what kind of game this is going to be. And if it's not a game I'm going to like, not a game I know I'm going to like, I'm probably not going to waste my time because I don't want to take that chance, right? I think the big lesson here is that this is why I genuinely believe this whole discussion, the fact that this is a discussion in the first place, is why so many RPG horror stories happen. Communication before a D&D game should not be this big of a deal. It should not be this complicated to literally take 5 freaking minutes out of your day to just tell people what's in the game. And people act like there's going to be some like huge debate or huge thing around the content of your game. Look, just tell people what's in your game, and if they're not willing to like back down on what they want or don't want in the campaign, they can find something else. That's what Session 0 is for. Ideally, you're having it before the campaign, right? So losing people that early, if they're not vibing with your game, good. You don't want to have people join into your game, and then you introduce stuff into the campaign that you're really into, but they're not, and then they quit then. That would suck. You want to get it over with early so no one gets too attached. I mean, seriously, it should be a no-brainer, but apparently it's some big deal to some people. And again, I think this is why so many horror stories happen. Seriously, I'm never going to run out of these things. At this point, I feel like I've seen everything, but I just keep on seeing more. Like, it just never ends. Because when you introduce the human factor, things get complicated. Now, keep in mind, speaking of horror stories, just 2 days ago, we did a horror story about some crazy stuff. And I said in that video, directly, Session 0 isn't a silver bullet because that group did Session 0. They did everything right, but it still turned out sucky. Look, Session 0 is not a silver bullet. Nothing in life is a silver bullet. Nothing is just going to solve all your problems. Other than watching The Owl House, I don't know why, but around the time I watched that show, my mental health greatly improved. My sleep schedule greatly improved. I have this... Oh, I touched the wire for the mic, sorry. My sleep schedule greatly improved. I feel this energy to do stuff in my life. So, I mean, I think The Owl House generally is a silver bullet to fixing all your problems. But other than The Owl House, The Owl House is not Session 0. Session 0 is not a silver bullet to every problem in Dungeons & Dragons. It can't solve everything. There has to be further communication even beyond that. But that kind of just proves my point, right? Even though it can't solve everything, Session 0 does solve a lot. But it's just the first step. Communication actually needs to go further than that if you want to maintain a good, healthy group dynamic. Sometimes you're going to have discussions mid-campaign. I've told this story before, but one time a player who, is a regular part of my game, he's been playing with me for years upon years at this point, he said something during game that made people uncomfortable. It was basically like he proposed a torture technique, and it kind of got like the crickets treatment from the rest of the party. And you know what? It was no big deal. I texted him, hey, might want to like chill out and stuff like that in the future. It made me and the other players a little uncomfortable, I think. And he responded with, yeah, sure, man, all good. I was just a little bit excited in that moment, and I got, carried away, and I wasn't thinking. And that was it. Literally 2 text messages, and all that was solved. But if Session 0, the step 1 of communication, if that is so contentious at the baseline, how the heck are people supposed to take this even further? And that is why horror stories occur, because communication has become contentious. The idea of talking to your friends is a controversy for some people. Now, I know it's not a controversy for you people subscribed here at Crispy's Tavern, because you people are smart and cool and classy. You're awesome. You're Amity Blight. And so am I. We all, hopefully, like communicating with the people around us. And I think it's important to keep that going. Show people that communication works, that it is healthy to have these discussions, even brief ones, before the game. And look, if people aren't vibing with what's in your game at session 0 and they want to leave, that's for the best. Yeah, it sucks losing players, but as a dungeon master, if somebody that's joining my campaign doesn't want hard combat, I want to know at the get-go so that we don't have that person in our games. I'm not trying to say that person is wrong or bad. I'm just saying that they are wrong for my campaign. I'm the wrong dungeon master for that person, and they should go find someone who's going to better suit their tastes. Because if they join my game, they might not have a lot of fun, and I might not have a lot of fun being their DM. Again, figuring all that stuff out early is so important. So, yeah, there is my discussion around session 0. I really hope I don't have to talk about this again. I have to talk about it all the time on horror stories already. So, talking about it on the pod for, what is this? Like, I don't know how long it's been. I think it's been 15 minutes. But talking about it on the pod, not my ideal form of existence. But, it is what it is. And I think with that, we're going to move on. If you guys are unaware, a couple weeks ago, I believe, no, not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before that, we had a tabletop tavern tips episode, a D&D advice episode, based around the Adventure Zone graduation. And it got my gears kind of turning because we were discussing it as a D&D game, not really as a podcast. I didn't love it as either. I wanted to talk about what makes a good D&D game, what makes a good D&D podcast, differences between the two as a person who has run a D&D podcast, and what we can learn from those differences to figure out how to make our games better. So it's basically like a further reading of what we did before. I kind of want to do this for tabletop tavern tips in the future. Let me know what you guys think. But without further ado, guys, let's get to that further reading. All right, so let's just reiterate what I was talking about, just in case you didn't watch the video from a couple weeks ago on the Adventure Zone graduation. If you're unaware, the Adventure Zone graduation was a D&D podcast that caused quite the hubbub because a lot of people thought it was bad, and not without reason. I don't think it's the worst thing ever made ever, but it certainly is the worst D&D podcast I have listened to. Again, I haven't listened to all of them. It was run by a DM who was fairly inexperienced, which, by the way, I understand why this podcast was the way it is, but again, if you're fairly inexperienced, straight off the bat, I don't think you should run a D&D podcast. If you're okay with all the mistakes you're going to make, then cool, but if you are inexperienced with Dungeons & Dragons and you get on live on Twitch, especially with a large audience, to run a D&D podcast, just be aware, it's going to be tough. It's going to be really, really tough. I just want to say that off the top. I understand why this happened, but at the same time, I also understand that it probably shouldn't have happened in the first place. But anyway, the Adventure graduation had a variety of problems, most notably that it was very railroaded, but at the same time had a very unfocused story, which should not be two things happening at the same time. There were way too many NPCs with a variety of problems. The combat was really boring to listen to, and I'm assuming to play, which is already a problem a lot of D&D combats suffer when it comes to live play experiences. But here it was particularly bad. I also don't think that the podcasting quality was anything to write home about. Even something like, I talked about it forever ago, but the D&D show Realms Apart was done by Momo O'Brien and her D&D group a couple years ago. And oh my God, that show is really good from a podcast standpoint. It's very, very well edited. And her Starfinder podcast is also done in that same style, though I apologize, I have lost the name because I don't listen to that show. But it's done in the same style. And from that perspective, even though a lot of the D&D elements of that podcast aren't really focused on, it focuses instead on immersing you into the story and the storytelling, and that is really, really awesome. That's perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for in a D&D podcast if I want that more story-based element. I like how Critical Role has a bit of both, but here it just focuses down on the story thing, and it's amazing. But again, the Adventure Zone graduation, it does a similar fast and loose approach, but without that increased immersion. In fact, there's very little immersion because again, it's super fast and loose to the point where sometimes it kind of snaps me out of the game. But yeah, that's all the stuff that I was not a fan of in the Adventure Zone graduation. By the way, if you like this show, no hate towards you. I think that's awesome. In fact, I'd argue that I'm jealous. I wish I liked the show because I watched a few episodes of it and I'm never getting those hours back. So if I enjoyed it, I would have had something to love instead of something to dislike. But my point with this whole section is I want to talk about like what makes a good D&D game versus what makes a good podcast. And more specifically, I want to talk about I want to talk about the differences between the two of them, because what makes a good podcast, what makes a good D&D game, separate sometimes. So off the top here, I think a good D&D podcast can rely on a lot of things. Just like D&D, everyone's looking for something different when it comes to their shows. Like the Adventure Zone Graduation is not the only Adventure Zone podcast. There's plenty of others that, in my opinion, are better. But, for example, Balance, their first ever podcast, again, didn't listen to the whole thing all the way through, but it was a very strong story from what I listened to, and it was very, very well done. Even though, again, it was a very fast, loose, very casual way to play the game. The DM was putting a lot into making it both casual, but at the same time emotionally engaging for both the players and, by proxy, the audience. I think as a dungeon master, when running a podcast, you are in a very, very unique role. You are both the host of the show, but also of the game. Now, when Matt Mercer, obviously the DM of Critical Role, says, like, I DM for my players first, and if the audience likes it, that's perfect. That's a really great mentality, but honestly, I don't mean it. I'm not trying to call Matt a liar, but I do think he considers the audience. I do think he thinks about the audience at least a little bit when he is DMing. Maybe he didn't initially, but I think that over time, he does at least think about what the audience wants, because frankly, Critical Role is a really good show that does often take into account what is going to be a pleasant listening experience for the audience, not just with the production, but also with the players and the dungeon master. Like, they go out of the way to make it a good audio experience for people to listen to. That is something that you got to consider. You got to consider how stuff is going to come off to an audience. Obviously, you need to, first and foremost, like the first priority is make it fun for your players. If your players are very obviously not having fun, you're going to end up with the Adventure Zone Graduation, a podcast where it felt like the players weren't engaged. And when they're not engaged, the people at the table playing the game, why the heck should I be engaged? Somebody who's just listening, right? So yeah, your first priority should be the players. But you also do need to consider, how is an audience going to think about this? How is an audience going to respond to this? It shouldn't be to the point where you prioritize the audience over the players, but you got to at least consider what they're doing. When I was running my actual play D&D podcast, Shadow over Karakonos, this was something I had to learn. In the beginning of that show, there was no battle maps available. I didn't record battle maps, but a few sessions in, I started recording battle maps. And you know what? I think it made the show a lot better. And it only added like 30 minutes onto the editing time, maybe an hour. So it was worth it overall for that style. So I could add that battle map in so that audiences could have a little bit of a visual. Because before that, I was describing combat, but I was really bad at trying to like put a picture in the audience's head about like movement and where things are and where things are going, etc. That was a big problem for me. And yeah, I could have just learned like, change up your descriptions, describe more things, help the audience to see what's going on the map more using your voice and your descriptions. But I didn't want to do that. So on the other hand, I could just add the battle map onto the screen and then boom, we're all hunky-dory, which is the approach I ended up taking. The reason I didn't want to do the former is because that's a big skill. That's a lot to learn. And honestly, it's not an easy thing to learn. It's not easy for me to change up my whole style of description. So instead, I'm going to do what's easier for me, but at the same time, something that's going to cater to that audience need, right? It's the exact same thing I was saying earlier, where you got to think about both. You got to think about yourself and your players, but you also have to consider your audience, right? So yeah, that was a struggle I had to deal with when I was doing my podcasts. Another thing that I think makes a good podcast, but sometimes is not a perfect thing for a D&D game, I freaking love sound effects, music, all of that. I love that in my D&D games and in my podcasts. I think adding sound effects and adding, ambiance and also epic music in the boss fights, I can't play D&D without it, honestly. Like, when my robot shuts down, my little bot that plays music into my Discord server, when that turns off, I legitimately will not play until I find some kind of substitute or until it turns back on. And my players are well aware of this. Like, every time it stops, it is so friggin' awkward. I cannot survive without music or sound effects. But I understand that for a lot of other people, that stuff is distracting or they don't like it. And frankly, for those people, I don't get you, man. I do not understand how you can play D&D with no music. Like it's just, that is beyond my brain space. Like without music, I'm just completely taken out of it. But hey, to each their own. However, on the podcasting end, I do think, again, maybe this is just a me thing, but I do think music and sound effects do elevate a podcast and help me to be more engaged. Knights of Evening Star is a D&D podcast that was hosted on the D&D channel, then it was moved to another channel. And honestly, like, I really love Mark Humes. I love the players, Anna Prosser and Nate Wants to Battle, like the OGs from Dice Camera Action, joined by Mika Burton, who's one of my favorite guests on Critical Role. Oh man, sign me up! But, no music, no sound effects. And that I got through a lot of episodes, like I think 30 episodes of that show, but eventually I just stopped because like I couldn't stay engaged, especially if I was like doing something else. Usually when I'm listening to something like Critical Role, sometimes I can get sucked into Critical Role and lose like the video game I'm playing or the menial edit I'm trying to do. With Knights of Evening Star, I often felt like I was losing the podcast instead, which not good. I don't think that's good. And again, I'm not trying to say Knights of Evening Star is a bad show. I really, really enjoyed it. It's just, for me, that extra level of immersion, it's needed. I do want to know your guys' opinions on that because, yeah, SFX apparently is something that some people don't like, and I want to know, like, why that is, because for me, it's absolutely mandatory, just both from a listening perspective and from a gameplay perspective. Now, something that the Adventure of Graduation didn't have to deal with, but since I brought Knights of Evening Star and we're talking about podcasts versus D&D games, obviously, when you're playing D&D online, you do want to be heard, and therefore you should probably try to get a decent mic. Nothing is worse than playing a D&D game where there's tons of echo and technical difficulties, where there's ringing in everyone's ears, and there's that one guy that no one can hear. Not fun. As a guy who's using music all the time, it is 100% mandatory for all of my players to have earbuds so that, the microphone isn't picking up like a speaker playing out loud. Because if music is being played into an out loud speaker or our voices are going to an out loud speaker, it's going to bounce, it's going to echo, it's going to be horrible, right? So headphones, earbuds, necessary. But for a podcast, you need to take it a step further, man. There is nothing worse than listening to a podcast where the hosts are garbled, the audio isn't balanced, I can't understand anything. If you're using music and sound effects, if the music and sound effects are too loud, oh God, no. That sort of stuff, whew. With Shadow over Karakonos and Crown of Deceit, like the reason I don't do those shows anymore is because I wanted it to be a good listening experience, but oftentimes it's hard to force that during an actual play D&D podcast. When you're trying to play D&D, you're trying to play D&D. And like workshopping all of the technical aspects, it's really hard without a crew. So therefore, you have to handle it in post. And anyone who's had to handle anything in post knows that people who say that casually, like, oh, I'm just going to handle it in post, are idiots. Because handling stuff in post is a pain in the butt. It's horrible. However, when you're running a D&D podcast, if you want this stuff to go big and want to get an audience, you do need to handle it. You do need to think about how it's going to be handled in post. You do want to think about how the audio is going to come across. You need to make sure that the quality is good. And that is hard. Like, even for a guy, like, I've worked in this industry for a while. Since before I was a freaking YouTuber, I was doing stuff with audio equipment and podcasting and all that. And even for me, like, this is a struggle. I remember when I moved into this space for the first time, obviously, like, you can see some of my sound panels, and I'm sure during my skits, you see more of my sound panels on the walls and such. But when I moved in here for the first time, the echo in this room was the worst. It was bad. It was so, so bad. And eventually I did get stuff to mitigate that, but it was hard. It was really, really hard. So I completely feel people who want to get into podcasting, D&D podcasting, but don't know how to really balance that sound. To give credit where credit is due, with the Adventure of Graduation, that wasn't really a problem. The McElroys, they are really good podcasters, and they have a good crew, I'm assuming, good production. And when they talk, I understand what the frick they're trying to say. and no one is too loud. That's really nice. So yeah, even if I wasn't blown away by the audio editing and the, all of that stuff from the Adventure Zone graduation, especially when you compare it to something like Realms Apart, I still think it was pretty good. As for other things I don't like in D&D podcasts, man, like I said earlier, I just cannot handle if it's so awkward listening to a podcast where clearly people are legitimately upset or not having a good time. Like, that just gets super, super awkward. And obviously there are examples I could come up with, but I don't want to say anything because I don't want to get, slandered. But, again, during the Adventure Zone graduation, it was sometimes hard to listen to that show because you could tell there was a vibe. I don't know for a fact what the feelings around the table were, but I do know that the show ended early, which kind of, that tells its own narrative. But on top of that, I get why those players were frustrated because, again, if you aren't thinking about your players and they're not having a good time, it doesn't matter if you're catering to your audience. Your audience are going to see that the players are not having fun, and that vibe is going to carry. That's why, even though I don't know if Matt Mercer never considers the players, I think that he considers Jesus. And that's why, even though, sometimes Matt says that he only thinks of his players, I still think he thinks about his audience, but he is smart to think about his players first. I do think you need to think about both, but he is right. The players come first, because if the players aren't having a good time, it's going to be a bad podcast. It's going to be a really bad podcast. So, yeah, there you go. That's my thing on how to do a good D&D podcast. If you want to get into it, then obviously, learn your lessons from the Adventure Zone graduation. I think there's plenty of lessons you could take away from that show, about what it means to both cater to your players and to cater to an audience. But for me, the big lessons I took away from running my own D&D podcast, number one, just be aware that if you're not doing it just live, if you do want to edit and you do want to make sure the audio is nice, just be aware that you're going to be in for the long haul. It's hard. It's really hard. I was working a lot on Shadow of Carcosa and Crown of Deceit. Also, be aware of how you handle yourself in front of a camera, how you carry yourself. It's really hard sometimes to tell how you come off to your players, to an audience. But hey, listening back to it is really, really useful. I'd actually say that even if you don't want a podcast, I do recommend occasionally recording your D&D games just to see how you sound. Don't get up your own head about it. Don't think you need to be Matt Mercer or anything like that, but just check on how you sound. Is this a pleasant person to play with? Just listen to yourself. It really helps me. I recorded the final session of my D&D campaign, my second D&D campaign, and every major session, sessions with big set pieces, I record myself in this third campaign I'm running, and I don't plan on publishing those recordings ever, but I listen to it, and I'm like, okay, is this good? Is this bad? What do I need to work on? That's really helpful, not just from a podcast standpoint, but just from D&D in general. Also, as many visual elements as you can get. Not just stuff that you commission. Commissions are awesome, but on top of that, visual references you find online or Photoshops you want to do. All that stuff is really, really helpful both for your players and your audience. The more stuff I can visualize, the better it's going to be for me, not only as a dungeon master, but also as a player. As a DM, visualizing things is really, really important to figuring out how it's going to come across and how I describe it on top of that. If I see it, it's easier for me to describe. But yeah, there you go. I mean, it's a very rambly section about D&D podcasts. Honestly, I usually go on DM Academy to figure out oh, hey, what am I going to do for this segment? But DM Academy is in a horrible state right now. They did some stupid forum idea, and it's awful. So I can't look at all the discussions anymore because it's so mishandled. So I ended up doing this instead. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I mean, I did enjoy this. I might do more of these sequels in the future. Sorry, this was kind of rambly, but I'm tired. It's nighttime and it's raining, so it's that vibe right now. But anyway, with all of that being said, I hyped it up already. But yeah, I had 2 awesome D&D sessions. After a D&D session that I thought was weaker, session 3 of my third D&D campaign. Weaker. But these 2 sessions I just ran, so much better. Let's talk about it in Campaign Diary. Hey everyone, we're back with Campaign Diary. we are covering sessions 4 and 5 of my third D&D campaign, The House of Devils, and these ones were good. So if you weren't here for the last time we did Campaign Diary, which was a while ago, it was rough. Session 3 of House of Devils, I didn't do a great job. Now, was it a horror story? No. I think it was still a really strong Dungeons & Dragons session, but at the same time, it was definitely not my best work. There was a lot of stuff that I messed up on, exposition that wasn't given, opportunities that were missed. And just like I said in that Campaign Diary, I used this session as a way to make up for that. So a big thing that I messed up in the previous session of Descent into the Veil, in session 3, the biggest thing I messed up was not establishing the main goal of the campaign well enough. If you're unaware, this campaign, the whole premise is that the party, the Snow Striders, they need to take this dangerous blade that has the soul of the powerful Oni progenitor, Dinrala Doji, locked inside of it. She's like a goddess of war inside this sword. They need to take it across the continent to the floating city of Sinmara so that a great blacksmith can reforge the sheath and keep her inside the blade. And even though there was this moment where they all got really interesting visions of the future, I should have taken that opportunity to show them visions of the past, to show them the stakes of what could happen if they fail, what the Oni are like, what their invasion would be like. I think the lore of the devils in my world is really, really cool, and I didn't properly communicate it. The intro to the Oni as an enemy was good from a combat standpoint. They started with an Oni spirit that had some cool mechanics where if it passed through you, it dealt damage, meaning if you were all bunched up, that's really bad because it can just like walk through all of you, not take an attack of opportunity, and easily deal tons of damage to the party in one go before making its devastating attack. So yeah, that's really fun. And they also fought an Oni boss that they had to get rid of by healing a certain object. So that was an interesting fight, basically changing the mechanics where you're fighting an enemy you can't beat, but the way to defeat it is through healing magic. That's cool. But yeah, even though I was proud of that, overall, session 3, not my best. Now in session 4, I started out by doing the thing I should have done in session 3. A vision of the past. Show them what the Oni were like. And I did this from the perspective of their lord and master, Dinrala Doji, the Oni progenitor, the great master of war. This thing was good. I think this vision went really, really well. At the top of the campaign, at the top of the session, right after doing the recap, we go right into the session, and the player holding the sword gets a dream, a vision, and they are essentially projected into the mind of this great Oni, and they experience firsthand her slaughter of the mortal people, and experience firsthand how she was imprisoned inside the blade. But I think the thing that was really cool was, first, throughout this, I very clearly communicated what she's about. A line that I repeated 3 times, rule of 3, is, I am war, conjured by war. That is what she's about. She is war. She's destruction. She is death. She is the blade breaker, the conqueror immortal. I based her speech patterns off Zivur Wrath from Destiny 2 because I think that character very neatly represents this character very, very well. In fact, if we were to take a chart of 3 characters that would represent Dinrala Doji, do Ginny D's character challenge for this antagonist, which is a good idea. I might try that one these days. But if we were to do Ginny D's character challenge for this character, I think one of the major characters that I would add in as inspiration would be Zivur Wrath from Destiny. Her speech patterns very much inspired this. The almost religious way she speaks about war and death and all the titles that she keeps on spouting about herself. I mean, it's just so cool and awesome. And I did that with this character. Again, clearly communicating. What is she? She is war. She is destruction. She is the conqueror immortal. So yeah, that was good. Immediately communicating what this villain is, and through the action she was taking in this vision, communicating what she can do, how dangerous she is. And even when she's imprisoned in this blade, I didn't play her as shocked or angry or scared. I didn't want to do that, because if I play her as that, she's not going to come off as threatening. Instead, I played her as pissed off, but patient. In the same way that Ganondorf, that's another character I wanted to take inspiration from, in the same way that Tears of the Kingdom Ganondorf was confident, if you're unaware, in that game, spoilers for Tears of the Kingdom if somehow you haven't played it already, in that game, Ganondorf is sealed away by magic, and in that moment, he is confident. All he says is that thousands of years will pass in the blink of the eye, and he is looking forward to seeing who is going to challenge him next. I took inspiration from that for Dinrala Doji, for this Oni mistress. I took inspiration from that in that she is also completely confident. Like, look, eventually, she will be back, for she is war. War is eternal, and she is conjured by war. So, in essence, I communicated a few things neatly in this. I communicated who Dinrala is, what she's about, her actions during this epic battle during the First Age, which I vaguely hinted at, but now the party can actually see. Big fights can be dangerous, especially with Oni. Fighting Oni may actually empower the blade and not in a good way. So yeah, all of that neatly communicated to the party with a vision that only lasted like 2 minutes. Awesome. It was really thematic. It was really cool. I'm really happy with how it turned out. After that, I did another kind of, not necessarily redo, but I wanted to do a better farewell. Like, in Lord of the Rings, when the hobbits leave the Shire, or when the Fellowship leaves Rivendell, it's a big moment. And we didn't get that in the third session. Like, I kind of just sent them on their way kind of unceremoniously. But here, the party didn't really care that I rewound back just a little bit. So they're still in the village, especially because I promised them extra magic items. Essentially, they got some gifts from the Snowstriders, their comrades. They got a magic rope, as well as a bag of holding, a handy haversack. So, you know, the two things every adventurer needs. And, you know, that was obviously really good for them. But on top of that, I let them say goodbye to the NPCs they care about. There were 3 NPCs that they met throughout the course of this prologue area, the first 3 sessions, and I gave them an opportunity to actually roleplay with those characters, have one last final exchange. I think that is a major improvement over just shuffling them off onto the next stage. Like, this time I actually thought about it and I actually was like, okay, look, this is something the characters want, this is something the players want. I think this will work. So we spent that time. We gave that roleplay some time to breathe, and it was so much better. Again, I understand that some people think this is stupid. Like, at the end of the day, look, my players did not care that we rewound a little bit. At the end of the day, the session 3, at the end, I just kind of shuffled them off. It's not crazy to think that they didn't actually leave in that moment, that they went back, took a long rest, and then left later on. It wasn't a big deal to my players. It wasn't a big deal to me. I'm not trying to retcon. I'm just trying to make sure that this campaign has time to breathe, and the story has time to be as great as it can be. Now, Session 4 was primarily a travel session, point A to point B, and I think this went really well. Number 1, a big thing was a skill challenge. I gave my players a skill challenge to handle, and depending on how they did in the skill challenges, I gave them small mini-games. For example, the opening survival check, if they rolled high enough, they saw an animal in the distance. And if they managed to slay that animal and cook it, they could get some temporary hit points for the rest of the day, which would be very necessary considering there was a difficult encounter on the rise. The players, and I have my players usually vote on the decisions. If they disagree on decisions, I usually have them vote. They voted not to kill this animal. They didn't want to do it. They thought it was cruel. They didn't want to kill this doe that was just minding its own business. That shocked me. I was like, what the heck? My players were like, no, I don't think my character would do this. I don't think we would kill this doe. Like, we're Snowstriders. We care about this land. We care about its beasts. And I don't think we would kill it, especially since if we have, because I told them they had food plenty. This would just be like really good food that would give them temporary hit points. And they said, no, if we have food enough to keep us fed, I don't think we kill this doe. They voted on it, and I was like, okay, dang, that's really cool. I'm used to my players making decisions in character, but they also really care about the out-of-game stuff. Because, again, you know, they also care about the mechanics. Because, like I said earlier, I'm running hard combat. So they want to make sure their characters don't die. But here, they gave up on a clear advantage so that they could do what their characters would do. I think that's pretty awesome. But yeah, the skill challenge progressed. It relied a lot on description, and I think a lot of skill challenges will rely on description. You need to have description and good ambiance when you are, doing a travel session. Otherwise, it's not very engaging. If I just say, you see trees, it's not going to be really cool. But if I have just a little blurb written up, then that's much better. Over the course of this travel, they were discovering signs of something out there. Now, at the end of session 3, they chose to go through the forest. I had 3 different ideas. They could either go through the lake, they could go through the snowy fields, or they could go through the forest. They chose the forest. And in this forest are gnolls. Now, these gnolls are not supposed to be here. They have invaded the sacred land for an unknown purpose. And at first, the party were unaware that these were gnolls. They found an empty campsite that appeared to have been destroyed by some form of dark magic. And they found a dead snow strider killed by arrows. Whatever destroyed the campsite is different from what killed this fellow comrade, this strider. That's different. So they've got 2 threats to worry about. Whatever was in this campsite that killed the snow strider, and whatever destroyed the campsite and ran off whoever was here. 2 threats. So already establishing mystery on this travel, some tension. The party decided to take a long rest after this, and here is where things took a turn for the unexpected. Keep in mind, in my games, I have a mechanic called Fortune. It's essentially just renamed Inspiration. I give Fortune pretty frequently, just if party members correct me on rule stuff or remind me of things, I'll give out Fortune. If my players answer my character builder questions before a session, I give them Fortune. And humans also get Fortune whenever they finish a long rest. So keep in mind, my party have plentiful freaking rerolls. But holy crap, the gods were not in their favor, because over this watch, here's what I expected to happen. Essentially, during this watch, the gnolls are going to show up. They're going to scout out the party, and then, if they're not spotted, during the 3rd watch, they attacked. Now, first watch, I had this event set up where that party member would see a fox. And the fox, if they feed it or roll good animal handling, the fox would bring them a small scrap of a symbol, the same symbol they saw in that campsite, implying that whatever was there, danger is near. So that would communicate immediately, oh, here we go. There's something going on here. But, number 1, the party didn't roll high enough perception or investigation to find the symbol in the campsite in the first place. And number 2, when they finally found the symbol on the fox, they took it to the only person with positive history, and even after rerolls, he rolled a 7. So I'm like, okay, great. So there's this symbol, you don't know what it means. Oh boy. So I was like, okay, no big deal. Second watch, a gnoll is actually going to show up, scouting out the party. All right, so at this point, you can roll perception checks, spout them out, and nope, the barbarian rolled like a 6. And keep in mind that player is like a god of luck. So I don't know how the heck this is a time where he rolled a 6. So I was like, all right, well, great. All right, well, they have not spotted these gnolls, like at all. They had 2, 3 chances, 1 more back at the campsite. So at this point, I'm really surprised. I thought what was going to happen was they'd spot this gnoll and follow it back to its lair, which is in a big mine. But that didn't happen. So I instead changed gears. I put down in my notes, if they don't spot the gnoll by the 2nd watch, the gnolls ambush on the 3rd watch. I did not have a campsite map set up, but I do have a folder just called Wilds of Iselheim. Iselheim is the continent. Essentially, it's just a bunch of maps of snowy wilderness made by Che Peku. And they're perfect. I just picked one of those, and I was like, I guess they're camping here, place the party members. And I have this feature in Foundry where I don't need to actually put my party members on the map. I can go there independently and set things up while they're not watching. So that's what I did, and they were ambushed. And this fight ended up being not as difficult as I think it would have been if they fought the gnolls in their lair, because in their lair, the gnolls also are being supported by an elven support unit called a Fire Speaker, a custom-made monster of my own design, who I'm sure will pop up in Crispy's Homebrew Corner whenever I finish the rest of the frickin' elves. But yeah, the Fire Speaker was a support unit that didn't pop up in this combat because, you know, in the story, the gnolls don't go out with that elf. The elf is directing their movements. He stays back at the camp. So, yeah, that made the fight easier. However, I think it's balanced out by the fact that in that camp battle, there's also a bunch of crystals that act as explosive mechanics that the party can use to get rid of the gnolls or disrupt the fire speaker's spells. So those crystals are absent during the camp ambush. On top of that, the gnolls are ambushing, meaning they automatically get top of initiative, they get a surprise round, they're stabbing at the party, and they're all prone, so they're taking these attacks at advantage. It's pretty brutal. So automatically the party are taking heavy damage. The barbarian hasn't raged yet. They're not ready for this attack. So, they're not, putting in the damage by half. Everyone is disoriented, doesn't know what's going on. So yeah, I think that this was still a difficult battle. The gnolls from Flee Mortals have a really cool mechanic. That mechanic is known as Death Frenzy. Essentially, when a gnoll dies, fellow gnolls can use their reaction to move half their movement and take a bite attack. This is awesome. It essentially adds this whole extra bit of chaos to fighting gnolls. Whenever you kill one, they're going to come after you, and they're going to come after you hard. So yeah, I like this a lot. If you put a bunch of small gnolls with a bunch of big gnolls, the chaos can erupt really quickly, especially if they're being killed in quick succession. It's important to note, though, that it uses their reaction, meaning gnolls often aren't taking attacks of opportunity, meaning my party were more free to move around the map, and that was a lot of fun. Do some clever spell use, some good rolls from the barbarian, and some very, very powerful smites from the paladin. The party managed to slay the gnolls. On one of the gnolls was one of those crystals from the mine, the explosive one. And through this crystal, they were able to kill the mage very quickly because they didn't know what was behind the big door. They didn't know there was a mine full of these explosive crystals back there. All they knew was, there's probably something bad back there. Let's open this door and just toss the crystal in. They didn't know there would be a giant chain reaction that almost blows up the mountain and them with it. But it was hilarious watching them react because I described the door opening, them throwing in the crystal, and then them realizing there's a bunch of other explosives in there, and the elf screaming because he knows he's about to be disintegrated. And the party's reaction was brilliant. There was laughter, there was cheers, there was rolls for athletics as the party book it away as fast as possible. It was perfect. I love that. That's the kind of chaos I love. Did I expect any of this to happen? No. Do I lament that my Arcanite mine map has been completely destroyed? A little bit, but hey, I can always use that mind map in the future, and at the end of the day, I think that's okay. What I had was a great session that, yeah, a lot of it had to be improv, but at the same time, it's okay, because a lot of my prep still carried over, and it was a lot of fun. They ended up meeting an NPC named Marin Luzada, who is an ally. So I have an ally system in my campaign now, because if you're unaware, I hate controlling NPCs. I hate controlling friendly NPCs in combat. I run pretty difficult combats, and that means there's a lot going on the enemy end. That's enough for me. I don't like running NPCs. However, my party do love NPCs. They do love having NPCs on their side. So I introduced Marin as a simple NPC that they could control. And they had a lot of fun with her. In the next session, they joined her to the Ivory Sanctuary that is under attack by a huge army of gnolls. The moment my party, well, they didn't actually see this, but the moment I described this to my party, they were so excited. They were all gasping, and they all looked like they were on the edge of their seat. As a DM, I love that. In the next session, they, again, a lot of unexpected stuff happened. During the combat, they were fighting the gnolls again, and I included a fire speaker this time, so we actually have one here. I got to test the mechanics of this custom-made support unit, and it went really well. I really liked how they enhanced the gnolls' attacks. Their teleportation ability had an extra enhancement effect that increased the attack power of gnolls that they teleported next to. So on top of being a movement tech, it was also a support tech, which was really, really cool. I think these stacking mechanics made the fight complicated, but at the same time really fun. And this was also the first time my party controlled Marin. I gave them her stat block, our barbarian took hold of her, and it was great. It was a lot of fun. And also, it helped them to get connected to her as a character, because later on in the session, Marin was in big, big trouble, and the party were willing to risk everything to save her. And it was intense. There was a lot of emotion in that moment, and they've only known her for a single session. So yeah, putting her in the hands of the party like that, and having her help them out in combat, awesome. So already, this is a much better batch of sessions than what we had going previously. Whereas in session 3, the exposition was rough, the character building wasn't there, I wasn't DMing as strongly. Here, I'm much more on point. I think it comes down to a couple things. A better pitch and a better premise. I think the premise of both these sessions is simple but strong. Session 4 was traveling from point A to point B. Session 5 is about helping Marin to sabotage the Null army. Simple as that. But with those premises, with those simple premises, it allows me to develop out a lot more complicated mechanics around it. Rather than trying to weave my way through a complex premise filled with complex lore, if we take something simple, I can focus on the game aspects of the game and actually create something fun for my players to experience. At the end of Session 5, we set up the next session where my party, they are dealing with a lot. Marin has been bitten by a werewolf, a Null werewolf, terrifying, and they have recently met with Zarok. Zarok One-Eye, a Null who is betraying the Chattering Horde, this army, and is going to help the party on their endeavors. He has told them that the Nulls plan their demise by sea as well. The Nulls have hired a group of pirates, and the party need to take care of them, which is a neat callback to our previous campaign. These pirates are from the Leviathan Isles, which is the place my Campaign 2 party, same people, set up shop. So now they've got to fight previous allies from another life. So we're all really excited for that. Overall, this was a much, much better batch of sessions. Much stronger, much more fun. I think I did a much better job here. And yeah, top lessons, I think that the major reasons why this was great, simple premise, better execution. I'm not saying complex premises are bad. I've had complex premises work before, but I think that those need to be developed over a longer period of time so that when you need to focus on the mechanics, you can do it. But yeah, there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed this campaign. I hope you learned something. Without further ado, guys, I think it's time to move on to Thing of the Week. Hit the thing. Wrote an entire freaking memo over the break, so good to know I'm being productive. But anyway, my Thing of the Week this week is Arcane. And I know, I've seen Arcane before. Actually, I've seen Arcane like 3 times before. But recently, my friends and I finished a Lord of the Rings marathon. And I was like, hey, we gotta watch something else now. Because we had a lot of fun with that Lord of the Rings marathon. One of them, he had seen Lord of the Rings before. He had seen Lord of the Rings before. But his girlfriend, my other friend, she had not seen it before. And she was very invested. And we had a really good time. Like, I hadn't seen Lord of the Rings all the way through in a while. And it was just really cool to watch those movies again. But anyway, after that, we wanted to see something else. And we put through a bunch of ideas, but we weren't really landing on much. The 3 that were kind of catching on were Andor, Castlevania, and Arcane. And we were going to watch Andor. Like, I was convinced that Andor would be the one because they like stuff like Breaking Bad. And so, I thought that Andor had similar vibes, but in the Star Wars universe, like that slower burn, more people-focused story, very political, stuff like that. And I really love Andor, so I was down to rewatch that. But I gave them the pitch for Arcane, and they wanted to see something animated. And I was like, this is one of the most beautiful animated shows I've ever seen. So, yeah, we started rewatching Arcane, and dang, man, I haven't seen the show in a year, and God, I forgot how freaking good it is. Like, this show is incredible. It's better, too, because now I'm watching with a better sound system. Like, before I had the bass, like, way blown out, so a lot of the fight scenes were ruined because of horrible audio. Hey, look, we're bringing back the audio lecture from the last segment. But anyway, here, it's so much better. And watching it with friends is amazing. Like, I know what's going to happen in the show, but they haven't. So I'm like watching their reactions, and they're both like super into it. We're splitting it up into the arcs. So, the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and we're doing that week by week. During Act 1, they were super engaged, but they were engaged in the way I would expect anyone to engage in a TV show. But it's when they got to Act 2 is when I realized they really, really loved this show, because when they got to my place and they were sitting down on the couch, I was just kind of shooting the crap, getting updates on their lives. I expected to have a long conversation before I start the show, but the moment I open Netflix, my friend, she cuts me off and is like, "Oh, I'm so excited for this," and I'm like, "Oh, they want to do this now. Okay, let's go." And then we got into Act 2 of Arcane, after the time skip, and they were even more engaged. They love these characters. I love these characters. We all hate Marcus. It's wonderful. If you haven't seen Arcane before, this is a 10 out of 10 show. I am not a League of Legends fan, at all. I actually don't like the game specifically, but Arcane is absolutely brilliantly made. It is beautifully well done. The animation is superb. The characters are amazing. I mean, everything about the show works in ways that it really shouldn't, but it does. So if you haven't seen Arcane, watch it. If you have seen Arcane, watch it again. There were so many details I missed out on the first time I watched this show. So yeah, absolutely check this out if you haven't already. It's so worth it. It's so good. But anyway, if you guys enjoyed, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of our content, then you can check out our Q and Play series. We'll answer your questions in a random unscripted format while playing some video games. It's linked in the cards. And while you're there, subscribe to Kryssalian Tavern to get more of our content as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories and thoughts, go down in the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment section 0 to let me know you made it to the end of the show. Hey, by the way, if you want to call in to give us your horror stories, voicemail link in the description down below. But even if you don't have any stories, in essence, like, comment, subscribe. We will see you all next time. Farewell.